Okay, just making sure that everybody is able to connect to the audio. But hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Madison Rodriguez. I'm a second year PhD student here at the University of Georgia in the Educational Psychology Department, and I have a specific emphasis in school psychology. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So Rara is currently a postgraduate student in race, ethnicity, and post-colonial studies at University College London. She's previously worked with Ashka on an initiative working to address structural racism in U.S. housing policy. She's also a co-founder of Groundbreakers, a network and multimedia platform centering community-driven change globally. She is also a UGA alum and received her degree in international relations. So she will be speaking on culturally sustaining media, how emerging platforms center agency, dignity, and multiplicity. So super excited to introduce her and have our speaker talk today.
Hey, thank you so much, Madison. And thank you to the conference organizers, just everyone who's been part of making this possible. And thank you to everyone present on the call as well. See some very familiar names. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to try to make it full screen here so everyone can see. Okay, can everyone see? Great, thank you so much. So I'm just going to get started. And so as Madison was saying kind of in the introduction, this is about culturally sustaining media in this session today. And really some guiding questions for this, and I'm going to get more into kind of culture and culturally sustaining kind of that phrase in kind of the subsequent slides. But really, where do we see media currently when we look at the media landscape that is really centering the dignity, agency, nuance, complexity of people? Because I feel often when we look at mainstream media now, we really don't see this. Too often when we see images, text, so all kinds of media, it can too often be dehumanizing. So really this session is just organized around these questions. What does it mean for media to operate in this way? What would it mean for this to be a norm? Where do we see this happening? And so I'm going to have kind of some examples in the US as well as globally. I'm going to start with some theoretical kind of underpinnings and then move to some case studies and speak about Groundbreakers as well. And then just have some interactive questions and then we can get to kind of Q&A. So just let me get started here. Just with the word culture itself. And so this is a quote from James Baldwin. And when I saw this, I thought it would just be perfect to start off with. And I think this is really getting to the difficulties in defining or approaching kind of what culture is. And I think in some ways this quote is speaking to an inherent failure in defining culture. And this was written in 1956. And so I think it could have just as easily been written kind of today. It's incredibly relevant. And it really kind of also gets to the porousness, the permeability of culture. So every time we kind of try to define it, and we might fail in defining it, there's still a possibility in that we keep trying again. And so I think it's just a really powerful quote to start off with in terms of the difficulties, the tensions maybe in defining what exactly culture means. And I think we have 26 people on the call. And so if we ask everyone, and I'm not going to do this, but if we ask everyone kind of what culture means to each of us, I think we might all say something slightly different. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that. There's the multiplicity in that too. So just to turn to Stuart Hall, who is a founding member of British Cultural Studies and just very significant in cultural studies at large, and the way he defines culture as this site of interpretive struggle. And so layering kind of that inherent failure with it, with the struggle, and adding in power relations as well. And so thinking about the relation between culture and media, and really as this space of where people are being kind of produced and reproduced by power relations, how people are being represented. And so really as media is that really key space in which this is occurring. So kind of moving here to these concepts, these forces of multiplicity and relation. And so I think it's really good to turn here to Edward Glissant and Aimé Césaire. Just to start off with Glissant, this quote, "Consent not to be a single being," which I think is speaking a lot to that multiplicity. And this is such a core of what I would like to speak with about today, kind of to argue about today, and talking about culturally sustaining media. And I think the emphasis on this word consent, that we must agree to be multiple, we must agree to really be in this kind of exchange and dialogue. In the way he phrases kind of these mutually liberated opacities, differences, languages, is kind of speaking to too often this Eurocentric drive to render everything transparent, to really reduce. And it's kind of saying everything cannot be known, kind of that emphasis on opacity, emphasis on people's existing on their own terms. So I think just in some of the cases I'm going to be sharing, I think we'll see kind of that core structuring in ways that we see media platforms structuring themselves. And then this quote, he's speaking about no more cultures without all the cultures. No one civilization that can be the metropole to the others. And I think it's a very powerful quote because kind of going back to the permeability, the porousness we were talking about just with the word itself of culture, how that exchange is so integral to what we're speaking about in terms of the structuring of media platforms as well. And then turning to Césaire, this quote, "Exchange is oxygen," which I think is so powerful. And we think about kind of that exchange with relation, with people who are different than we are, as being essential to fully breathing, being essential to fully being alive. And so going with that concept of relation, I have on here a picture of the Poetics of Relation. I hope you can see it. This is a text by Glissant, it's from the 1990s. And the way that he defines relation, the Poetics of Relation, is kind of where each and every identity is expanded through relationship with difference. And you can see this is a map of the Caribbean, that this is on the cover. And it's very interesting to look at this kind of rendering of the map, where so often I feel like we're used to looking at kind of latitude and longitude, very horizontal and vertical. And you can see that this is more diagonal. There are slants to this. So it's just very interesting to think about multiplicity in this kind of visual rendering as well. And also just bringing in with this conversation around multiplicity and relation, I think this is a very powerful quote from Lola Olufemi, who is a very prominent feminist, particularly in the UK space. This is a recent book that she has, and she's had very prominent books kind of in recent years. And she's talking about kind of bonds and relation, mutual commitment to remain involved beyond the narrowly defined limits of the law. And there's a quote from Glissant as well. He's saying, "The human vow to bind, to relate." So we may think beyond politics, beyond these kinds of structures, kind of within them as well. But what is the vow that we make to one another? How does this vow show up in media, show up in the stories that we might tell? And so with the articles, with publications that are part of media platforms, how do media platforms also serve to convene people, to bring together people from all around the world to kind of create that kind of exchange, to build trust, to build community? How do we see this happening? And so we're going to get more into that in the cases in just a bit. So before going to the cases, I really want to go more into language. So kind of a brief note on language here. So culturally sustaining, this originally came from pedagogy. So the phrase culturally sustaining pedagogy, which is very focused in the education space. And it goes beyond just being kind of informed by different cultures of being relevant, really trying to actively affirm, particularly children and young people. And this is in relation to temporality as well. So thinking about the future, thinking about future generations, still being very active, culture very much celebrating, embracing of their culture. So just want to, I know we're speaking about media, but also want to kind of recognize this roots in pedagogy I think this applies to just every facet of society as well. We can think about healthcare, government services, everything kind of being culturally sustaining. Not just a culturally sustaining lens, but really embedded in everything that we do. Also, asset-based framing. And this is coined by Tramian Shorters, who started the organization Be Me, which we'll return to kind of at the end of the presentation. And asset-based framing, I think, is so core and critical to everything with culturally sustaining media. So asset-based framing is really starting from the strengths and aspirations of people, groups of people, rather than kind of deficit-based framing, which is really, deficit-based framing is really about what are these perceived weaknesses or enforced narratives that are coming from outside that are really looking at people that is not, that can be very dehumanizing. So asset-based framing is really starting from what are the core strengths? What is really humanizing language? And it's also not just the text, it's not just language, it's images as well. What images do we choose to share about people in the media that we use? And there's also just bringing our attention to the Emancipator, there's a Justice Dictionary, and this is from 2022, but very much a living document. And so this is very much a resource guide for emerging ways to speak about different groups, especially kind of in emerging situations we're in the world, like COVID-19, certain terms that they have related to that as well. And so it's not just the Emancipator, there are so many different groups, media organizations that have different resource guides just for anyone. You can be in academia, you can be a journalist, but it's really a great resource to turn to in speaking about kind of different topics. So our first case, I hope everyone can see, I know the text might be a bit small in some cases, but this is URL Media, which is kind of very new, very emergent. It stands for Uplift, Respect, and Love. Very much mainly based in the US, but you can see by some of the names here that it's kind of touching globally, mainly in the Caribbean. So I think if we think about kind of relation, multiplicity, networks, this is a great example of that. So you can see kind of a network of specificities here. So each of these, again, I hope you can see, there's 20 of them. They are all very specifically targeted. It can be to a specific group, specific identified culture, region. For example, Word, you can see in the top here, is really focused on Chicago, focused on catering to people in Chicago. And then Epicenter, if we move, here is focused on New York City. Scalawag, kind of across the screen, is very focused on the American South, so Southern politics, providing kind of humanizing takes, humanizing language on so much of what is occurring in the Southern region. And so you can see all these different network members who have come together. And it's really exciting to follow URL Media, because I think around last year when I started reading their work, I think there were maybe 5 or 6 network members. So they're really, really growing. You can see kind of how powerful that they are. Right now they are in a newsletter form. So if you're interested, I highly recommend, I can put resources in the chat, but they do a lot of multimedia. So they have workshops, they have radio forms, videos. So they really are growing very quickly. Also speaking about the Funambulist, this is a global example. They're based in France. They have a lot of content, mainly in French and in English. I think they're trying to expand to different languages. So the Funambulist is a platform, as this is their own phrasing, to speak about the politics of space and bodies. So you can see how this really touches so many elements of history and kind of current events as well. And so they have, I believe, 46 issues. You can see these are just a few examples. They are a platform really to connect activists, advocates, and scholars. So they're more on the intellectual, scholarly kind of realm. And it's really about making theory something very, very active, very lived in the world. And so these are just a few examples. You can see some of their recent volumes. I also want to just speak about here a little bit, the focus on their art, their cover art is really key to what they do. And I have kind of a physical copy here of one of You can see the center in the United States. So I hope everyone can see that a little bit. But they always have a kind of incredible artwork to illustrate their visions and everything that they're speaking about. And staying with this kind of artistic rendering, I think I just want to show one example. This is from, we just saw the issue, they have an entire issue devoted to the Algerian independence, the Algerian Revolution. And so I think especially their maps, and if we think back to kind of the cover of the Poetics of Relation, kind of the use of latitude and longitude, how we see here a very kind of similar map in that way, showing the interrelation of this revolution independence with so many other kind of revolutions, radical movements all around the world. And so the influences, the shapings, for example, of radical movements in Ireland to the revolution in Algeria. And there's an article about that kind of in that volume. But I think just seeing this illustration, this is also an incredible teaching tool, and not just for Algeria, but we can see for so many independence movements, so many revolutions, kind of seeing them as somewhat porous, seeing the interrelation that is so critical to them, critical to their success. So just really want to emphasize that artistic rendering there. The most recent issue, actually, of the Phenomenalist is called Questioning Our Solidarities. And I just pulled just some text from the introduction, because I think it really illustrates, kind of goes into conversation with the quote from Olufemi that we were looking at, about bonds, about how media can bring together groups of people to write and to speak about news and present about news, but really how those relationships with each other. And I think in particular, this is an example of having hard conversations publicly and very openly. And so this is a very introspective, reflective volume where they invited activists and scholars to really say, kind of, what are our blind spots? What have we learned about our work in the past? What can we do better going forward? And I think that is only possible when you have really strong bonds, when you have really strong trust among people. And that's because the Phenomenalist is so dedicated to bringing people together, creating that relation in a very sustained kind of long-term way, in a very kind of globally engaged way. And so I just really want to kind of have this quote. This is from their main editor, because I think it really represents their values and kind of indicates that really well. Again, this is just pulled from that most recent issue of Questioning Our Solidarities. So you can see kind of some of the emphasis on the artwork that they have, some of the topics that they're speaking about, the ways in which they've really brought people together to really challenge each other, but in a very generative, kind of loving way. Those were some cases. There was the URL Media and the Phenomenalist. And speaking now a bit about Groundbreakers, which I've been engaged with, and we'll speak about kind of our approach to media and what we're looking for as well in our network. And so Groundbreakers is a global network of leaders. We speak of them as the Groundbreakers, and we're also a media platform. So focus on kind of creating platforms of learning and exchange for local and community leaders globally in over 65 countries. We see media as a big element of this, and really telling stories about what the Groundbreakers are working on, what they're engaged with, really trying to practice the kind of culturally sustaining media, practice that asset-based approach. And so before I get into, I have an example from this first article here. And these are just some of the articles that we published. But just want to speak about kind of who a groundbreaker is, who we're looking for, because that is so intertwined with the media. So we really look for a groundbreaker who is driving structural change. And so we're kind of seeing levels of social change in terms of you can drive change on an individual level, really structural level as well. And so we're really looking for that kind of sustained systems change that groundbreakers are making. Also looking for that holistic asset-based approach in ways in which they work in their community, ways in which they're engaged with just everyone that they are accountable to. And we also look for groundbreakers who are working in coalition. So how are they networked? How are they in relation? How are they really growing the work that they're doing? So just to name an example of a groundbreaker, before I move to these articles. So groundbreaker, Zarlash Halamzai, she founded RTI, which is the Refugee Trauma Initiative. And I think this, everything I was just speaking about with the structural change, the coalition building, holistic asset-based approach, really embodies this. So she was looking at the humanitarian aid system in Europe, in particular Greece. Greece is the main country that she works in. And was seeing that this humanitarian system is really made of people who don't have the lived experience of being refugees or seeking asylum. And so because of this, the programming interventions are really not contextualized in the way that they could be. They're not trauma informed. They're not asset-based oftentimes. And so she was looking at this and saying, how could this be changed for the better? And particularly starting in Greece. And so she started at a small scale with her initiative, particularly working with young people in very holistic, trauma-informed ways. And I think the key thing about the way that she's driving structural change is she started working with local government workers in kind of the Greek local government. In terms of doing trainings that are holistic, that are asset-based, in ways that she could grow her scale and of her impact, instead of having to kind of have RTI working in every single locality in Greece, instead of really working with the government to embed the work that she's doing, the programming that she's doing. So I think that's just one brief example of a groundbreaker. And to go kind of a bit more into the media. So this is a brief part of a post by Leslie McCullers, who's a writer with Groundbreakers. She's very passionate about health equity, and so that's what a lot of her content is centered around. And so a lot of our approach to media is centered around the groundbreakers. And so we have the research element, but we really have that action-based element of what are the groundbreakers leading, what are they kind of saying when we interview them, when we work with them. And so we really work to weave that action-based focus with the research, with ways that people who are reading the content can really take action, that they can really get involved with their work in their community, as well as kind of more nationally and globally as well. So you can see in this example, I know it's a lot of text, but you can see kind of the ways in which different organizations are being named. And this is just kind of one example of an article in the kind of media that we try to work with. We have multimedia, podcast, articles, videos as well, because we think, again, rooting in that multiplicity, that it's so important to kind of have many different ways that people can access media, and really working to translate content as well. So this is really, I've shared just a few examples. There are so many out there, and the ones on this slide are mainly in the US, but there are so many around the world of examples of culturally sustaining media. And so we spoke about Be Me when talking about asset-based training. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about some of these. The Emancipator is, and we were talking about, they released that resource guide. The Emancipator is actually kind of a reactivation of the first abolitionist newspaper in the United States. So it's a collaboration between the Boston Globe and the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, who have come together to kind of reactivate, kind of continue the lineage of this newspaper, really illustrate the significance of the press, the abolitionist press, newspapers, during the 19th century, and so continue that legacy as well. Spoke about Being Me, and then Anti-Racism Daily is a daily newsletter on primarily news, but many different topics. Again, they have that kind of multiplicity. They have a podcast, they have all kinds of media, videos, social media, workshops, different trainings, so all different ways to be involved, different ways that individuals kind of reading their content can take action as well. So I was hoping we could actually make this interactive because there are so many different media sources. And these are, again, there are just a few of them. So I was hoping maybe we could use the chat feature. So if anyone does have further examples kind of in your daily life, kind of media that you look to, that you're reading, maybe we could take a few minutes to kind of put in chat any media that you would like to share. Okay, we have Counterpunch. Anyone else? Let's see. Oh, thank you. See Riot Heart. Would anyone like to just say a bit more about the media that they showed?
Hi, Rara. I will. I put the Counterpunch one there. I was also going to put another one. I was just trying to find the link to it. I just thought, well, I was looking, I suppose it's kind of examples that I drew on with things that have been there for a long time, maybe because of my own age and but they were sort of what I would turn to as not as certainly they're nonprofits, I'm sure they are, but as sort of disruptive centers that change the conversation. And so when I was looking at, as an outsider to the US, when I first looked as from far away for like 15, 20 years ago, I remember thinking of Counterpunch as being really quite unique in just in terms of the scholarship and what the way they wrote and the kind of issues they were talking about. And it was about, but it wasn't local. I would say it was much. It was dealing with local issues, but also international issues, and talking about how sort of the local was influenced by the global. And so it was interesting to have that sort of perspective. Another one I thought I would include, and I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, but I thought I would include the UK, a very, very old newsletter magazine called Private Eye. And why I'm including that is because it really focuses on class-based issues a lot. All of the things that don't get covered by mainstream media at all, and really very detail focused. So it's written sort of the stylistic elements are almost very old school, as unattractive as possible, I would say. Very, very, like, they're not investing in the glamour, they're investing in the stories, and the stories can be about what happened in a little local village church, but it's about something that's really significant to real people, and not just something quite abstract. So those are the two that I thought that I don't know if they're too big to count as things that are grassroots, but they certainly both began as very sort of grassroots type initiatives and took on a life of their own, I suppose.
Thank you so much. And just out of curiosity, when were they created? Or like, how old are we speaking about?
Gosh, I can look that up for you. Private Eye. It's very, very old. But I'm probably gonna have to look up Wikipedia because they don't really say it.
Oh, no
They were
worries.
first 1961 is Private Eye. And Counterpunch was 1994.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing too, because I think that culturally sustaining media can be centuries old. It can be, have really, really long lineage. So it really, I think we see so much that's emerging now, but it's so rooted in so much work that's kind of just ongoing as well.
Yeah. Would you say that, while we're talking, would you say that, I imagine certain news networks have programs or aspects of their programming dedicated to specific issues, and how does that tie in with the kind of work that you've showcased here?
I think there are tensions with that. And I think that's a question that always kind of comes up, because I think if the core of the organization, if we're talking really massive media, if we're looking at the funding, the leadership, if that's not changing, then I don't think that this is really as transformational as they may be saying.
Yeah. Do you think that it's more sort of lip service, or what are they what are they trying to do with it? What is the intention there, would you think, given your years of experience and looking at these things?
I think it really depends. So I think it depends on the intention, and then not just the intention, but really what is the reality of what they're doing. So I think there are some cases where you have a very large news company. And so one part of it, or one initiative, as you're saying, is doing really culturally sustaining work, really grassroots engaged work. But if it's not really changing kind of the core elements of the organization, I think sometimes as well, we have to look at the timing. So is this very short term? Does it only have funding for a year, 2 years, 3 years? Because if the central leadership, I think, and funding mechanisms are not trying to make this very long term and really core to everything that they do, and we have questions.
Can I ask one more question?
Oh, yes, please.
I was wondering your focus. I was thinking if you're familiar. Wanted to ask if you're familiar with something like Substack, where there are these. So it's not like a whole organization, but it's a newsletter sort of forum, and I see increasingly more people using Substack to do a lot of grassroots type, sort of at least dialogue and discussion. I've certainly seen it in the context of issues around body image, where it's really like nothing in the mainstream media was doing that. So I was wondering if you're aware of that and could comment on how does that fit in well here or not?
Absolutely. I think there's so many creators that are on Substack, and I think that's more geared towards kind of being an individual, that this is your newsletter, this is what you're putting out there. And I think there's incredible, I didn't even get into all of that, but it really is such a big part of this. I think that can get a lot into mutual aid as well. In terms of Twitter, I think this is all very interconnected in terms of individual creators, what they're putting out there, kind of media kind of underneath sometimes. Larger stream media where people find information, even Google Docs. So I think just one example with COVID, at the very beginning, there were a lot of resources that people were trying to find, particularly with mutual aid. In a lot of places people were on Twitter, people had just very large Google documents. And so I think that kind of putting that in dialogue with Substack as well, that's more kind of individual creators, which I think can be culturally sustaining, but not always, that we see.
Yeah.
I saw a previous question here about virtual spaces.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. And so I think the AI space, virtual spaces are very, very interesting that we see. And also there's reason to be very skeptical. So I think the same questions of when we look at major news in terms of who the leadership is, what is the intention, the funding. So for example, kind of the current chatbots, what are the algorithms going into this and feeding this? And I really want to point here to the work of the Algorithmic Justice League, who is really trying to counter a lot of bias that we see throughout kind of the metaverse that we see in different AI platforms. Also the work of Timnit Gebru. So I think I would point to a lot of their work as really trying to use AI. There's so much potential for that technology to be very inclusive, very generative, safe spaces, but I think it depends upon what is actual technology feeding into this. Is that technology perpetuating biases that are already existing in society? What is the intention there? So I think that's a very complex space, and there's a lot of skepticism that we need to approach kind of much of it. Oh, thank you so much for putting the link.
Are we in the Q&A, Rara? Or do you have more to the? Sorry, we just jumped in because you asked us to jump in. But do you want to finish the presentation, or is this the last? Are you just opening it up for Q&A now?
Oh, my apologies. I'm opening up now. So this is kind of last time. So we can go ahead now.
I say, it looks
Okay.
like you have another question. Anthony says, how do you think someone should determine if a media source is good or trustworthy?
Oh, this is a great question. I think it depends upon how you see. So for example, if we see, I'm just going to use a specific kind of case. If this news source is in a certain city, or they're catering to a specific community, I would really look to that community. What is the feedback that they're getting? Because we can see so much of what a leader might be saying is going on, but we only know if that's true by how people are interacting with their content. What is the engagement looking like? So I think that's a great way to trace the kind of accountability that we see in just your own personal values as well. Because I think we all have to judge what we engage with, where we put our money towards. I think all those types of questions. Is this media source, it can be very local, it can be very large national media source. Are there stated values in the way that you see them live those values in their leadership and the content that they put forward? are these matching? Because I think if they're not matching, then there are questions that need to be raised. But I think kind of following your own values where that might lead.
So I can ask it out loud. Can you share some examples of best practices in setting up this kind of nonprofit who's trying to do grassroots groundbreaking work? Maybe things to avoid, or I'm imagining a lot of people start things and it just goes nowhere and it dries up quick. It's kind of how do people sustain their energy, because does take a lot to do such things. So and to start and proceed and like maintain it. What have you seen as best practices there?
I think this is another great question. So I think, I'm just thinking about the different examples here and the kind of lessons that we learned from them. And I guess starting with the media element and growing a network. So I can kind of start there with Groundbreakers, because we started with kind of very small network, 0 people. We have expanded to this very global network that we have. And so a lot of it with the media, the advantage of when you're writing articles, when you have a podcast, when you have a lot of engagement like that, a lot of those interviews do lead to building the network. And I think just creating opportunities for people to connect. So we would have all kinds of, especially during COVID, webinars, just opportunities for exchange, people to kind of stay and be engaged with Groundbreakers, have active social media. And so I think really having something substantial that matches with people's values that they can really engage with is something that has been a core strategy that we've been using. And I think I'm just, as I've been following and engaging with a lot of these organizations as well that I've mentioned, I've seen that as a core strategy. Something else to say is just relationships. So speaking about URL Media, the first 2 network members that we see, they are the co-founders of URL Media. And so they were seeing, both of those co-founders were seeing this is a need that we have to have kind of this larger network of grassroots news. And so they came together and they just created it. And they already knew several of these different organizations and news members. And then the network members they bring on, they all have their own networks and communities as well. So I would say kind of follow the network. This is all kind of webs and maps as well. So I think pointing to that too.
Yeah, there's another question that popped up. They said, what do you think the impact of mainstream media and globalization on the potential loss of need to promote and preserve cultural identities of the upcoming generation? And do you know any statistics of interaction and involvement with culturally sustaining media from the young generation?
Oh, these are all such good questions. Thank you, everyone. I do not have particular data, but I can speak about specific examples. I think that's always a great way to kind of proceed. Cultural identities. So I think in particular, there's a groundbreaker who's working in Haiti. And I think when we talk about language and culture, this is very, very relevant. And we think about French and Haitian Creole. And so what she's really doing, she wants every student, every young person, every child in Haiti to grow up learning Haitian Creole in contrast to kind of this imposed language of French. And so I think when we look at the work that she's doing, and there's so many similar initiatives that Ashoka is involved with, Groundbreakers is involved with, these are all kind of these networks, that we see these efforts to be very affirming, culturally sustaining for young people. And so I'm happy to put some of these in the chat as well, because I think these are really the efforts that we need to be looking to. I think so much has to do with education, with the media that young people are seeing, and so much has to do with language as well, kind of preserving, affirming, celebrating that language. We can see examples in our country needing to go beyond English, for example, and in so many different contexts that we see.
I have one more question, if it's possible to ask, Rara. I'm wondering whether, is there an issue of sort of competition between organizations for attention, it's sort of when, if you're looking for contributors, donations, whatever you might have it, there's this issue of, people may not have as many resources to give out. So can you speak a little to that topic?
Yes, absolutely. I'm just going to put the name of an organization in the chat here before I start speaking about it. So I think in terms of that kind of competition, I think that's very normal or familiar for people working in nonprofits. And I think that really operates with a very scarcity mindset, when really we can see so many examples of kind of in another way, kind of abundance or really generative spaces where there is so much. And so I think a great organization to look for is community-centric fundraising, which is really speaking about, and they have a lot of media, they have a network as well. And this is all that they do. And speaking about, there is so much that individuals have, that organizations have, that really if we work together and we operate with that mindset of that kind of abundance. And I think that they really demonstrate that that's very possible. And we see this as well with so many other organizations on the screen. They all have their own kind of fundraising campaigns. They know that the people they're targeting are also giving to other campaigns. I think also a little goes a long way. So you may give even just $5 to the Emancipator, $5 to Be Me, or $5 to Anti-Racism Daily. But if a lot of people are doing that, hundreds and thousands of people are doing that, it really makes a big difference. So I think that's a lot of what organizations are using in their approach. Oh, thank you for the link. Oh, what is Giving Circle?
Gosh, okay. I just came across this very recently, which is that people in a certain community, like I think there's one in Athens, you get together, everyone puts in a little bit of their own money, but each person advocates for a cause, and they use that sort of Giving Circle community, as far as I've understood it, to raise funds for their cause. But each person is an advocate for something local in the community. And so that I just came across that recently, and I think there was a TED talk by someone who started this off a couple of years ago. But yeah, it's probably not relying on an organize. It's like not everything. You can't perhaps always have an organization for it, but looking at the individual level, what could you potentially do if there is no, if you neither have the something in your community that you want to address, but actually you're the only one who might be really focusing on one specific issue.
I think that's very, very relevant, and it ties in so well. I think it's very interesting to think about just the form and the structure that a nonprofit 501c3 isn't always needed for this kind of money. When we look at mutual aid, a lot of times these are communities, they're networks, they're people coming together, but they're not that official organizational structure. And sometimes they can kind of move funds quicker to where there is the need as well. So I think these are all very related, very similar kind of efforts that, again, that multiplicity that's so significant there.
Thank you, Rara.
Yeah, Rara, I just had one question for you. So you really hit on the idea of like strengths and like asset based framing in media and like practicing that. And so I guess I was just wondering like how you think like companies can go about training people who are working in media to kind of frame their frame it into that, and having like, those who are studying like graphic design and implementing that in their education, and just your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think it's so important. I think it should be in every media, every research. I think it touches just everything in society. So just as you were saying, kind of the graphic design with images that people are using with text, I would really point to kind of very specific things. So I think just language, the resource guides, there are so many of them, for example, the Emancipator. So I think just in terms of how we speak about certain words that we use. And so I can just give one example. When we think about housing, a lot of times in the housing space, the word blight is used. And this is very deficit-based language, and it's really kind of projecting a lot of ideas about what certain neighborhoods are, without even getting into kind of structural kind of histories. And so I think avoiding a word like that, avoiding kind of, and the reason why not to use that type of language, and instead how to, what language to be using. So always to be very specific. I think a lot of times media can be very generalizing about regions, about kind of in that way. I think also when we look at kind of news, the images that are used about people really, really differ. And so particularly in Western media, reporting globally, we see the images that they choose to use can be very dehumanizing. And so I think there are kind of basic kind of levels to what language to be using to avoid, what images to be using that is very humanizing, that is asset-based. And so also just kind of rooting in that. I would point to as well, I'm going to put this in chat, the Global Press Journal has a style guide. And they really emphasize, as I was just talking about, very much specificity in terms of how we're speaking about countries, groups of people, to be as humanizing and specific as possible. So they have kind of, if you're talking about this certain topic, this is really the best way to do this. And the people that kind of made the style guide are local journalists who are from the place that they're speaking about. Thank you so much for the link as well. Everyone can see people who are saying this is really the most respectful language to be using. And I think that's really the best way that style guides can be created, by people with lived experience, from people from kind of the place that we're speaking about.
Thank you so much, Rara. Does anybody have any final comments or questions before we close out? Rara, do you have any like final comments or anything that you'd like to share before we close out?
Yes, just want to thank everyone again. And if any of these organizations, media sources interest you, so the ones that were in the presentation, or the ones in the chat that Anna was sharing about too, really, I think the kind of call to action here is just go support them, go engage with them. Where you are in your local community, if you're interested nationally, globally, I think this is really the way forward, is to engage as much as possible with this kind of media. And so that's really kind of my parting words, and really just want to thank everyone again.
Well, thank you so much, Rara, for speaking and informing us with so much information. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you, everybody who joined today.
Well, we'll have a break now. This is the final morning session. There'll be an hour's break, and then we start off again at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you all for being here. Rara, Madison, thank you so much.
Thank you.